Hello and welcome to the Storyteller with Puck podcast. We will, as always, start with a story.
It was early February 2011. I can remember it vividly. It was a month after the anniversary of my parents' death a year before. They both died either side of Christmas 2010. And as if I could ever forget, our house flooded in between, and I was in Africa at the time. And yes, Christmas 2011 was in Cambridgeshire, Ely Cathedral, carols, and then tramping the fields. If ever anybody's ever been in Britain in February, you know what it's like. It's damp, it's cold. You need the sun to cheer you up, and it wasn't there. Anyway, it was when it really brought home to me that my parents were no longer there, that the support had gone. And in the previous year, my wife and I had cleared up their estate, and anybody who's had to do that knows what that's like. I'm just glad my dear old dad, being in the forces, was so organised. It made it easy for me, painful but easy. And yes, they'd gone, and there we were tramping the fields and talking. And it's one of those sort of moments in your life, a sort of a signpost, sort of telling you, well, is this a time for a change? And it's not the first time it's happened to me. It happened in my 30s when I went traveling and left 15 years in the wine trade. But this time was another of those moments. And this time, in conversation, I said to my wife, is this the time to live the dream? We all have I wished I'd done this, that, and the other. And most of us perhaps do one or two. And in my case, I had a long list, and top of the list was living the dream in Africa. My wife's Zimbabwean. We got married out there in my mother-in-law's garden, and I'd been going out there ever since I was 21. So that's a long time ago. And when it became Zimbabwe in 1981, and I just fell in love with the rich smell of the soil, the big blue wide skies, and just the culture, black and white. It was just so alien, and I've been going back ever since. And from that moment, I just wanted to keep going back. I'm ashamed to say that I probably know Africa better than I do Europe on my own doorstep, which is pretty embarrassing. This suddenly is this moment. I thought, let's go for it. Instead of just going there on visits and on holiday, why not actually try living there? Now, it's one thing going somewhere on holiday, and as anybody who's actually moved to another country, it's quite another living there. With Africa, very much so. A country like Zimbabwe, if anybody knows it, it's a country with a troubled history, and there is never a good time. Best time to move to somewhere like Zimbabwe is right now, whenever that may be. So we packed all our belongings up. I became an expert in eBay, and we rented the house out, and off we went and gave it a try. I continued what I'd been doing in the UK, which was landscaping. I had actually, ironically, as a writer, just qualified as a copywriter, but that's not what I went out to do. I went out to set up a business once again as a landscaper, but in a different country. I remembered vividly that first day. Mother-in-law giving me my office, which was a back room where she had staff, and this is where the lady did the ironing. Well, it was now my office, and I was given a telephone, this office, and 4 names, and then left to get on with it. And that's when I really got out of my comfort zone. I was somebody who viewed the telephone, and it was the telephone in those days. We're not talking iPhones. And it was, to me at that time, the great Satan. I hate, the idea of picking up the phone and actually speaking to somebody was my least idea of fun. But I had to get on with it. And it was the best thing that ever happened. I got to know people one guy who became my mentor. The generosity of people in the same industry it taught me a lot. And in fact, my crowning moment after 4 years there was winning the garden design trophy, beating my mentor, who took it very well. But it was a crowning moment after an interesting 4 years in which I learned how to deal with big corporates on the phone. I'm not a corporate animal, which at times has been a good thing, but at times it's been a challenge. This is when I learned how to negotiate with some big clients. I had opportunities there that here, back in Britain, where you're a little fish in a very big pond and you have to shout loudly. Over there, it was the reverse. And I had big corporates contacting me, asking me to landscape quite a few hectares. And I learned how to produce bills of quantities and documents that, well, if I'm honest, in the past, I'd had a stab at it, but nobody had ever formally trained me in producing detailed documents. And you only make the mistake of ordering enough cement to supply an entire town, never mind one person's properties. So you learn to get the decimal point in the right place. And negotiation, when people are playing straight with you and when they're playing games. And without going into too much detail, Zimbabwe is not for the faint-hearted. It teaches you how to negotiate with people who aren't playing straight, how to have a thick skin, how to walk away from disappointments all the time and just pick yourself up and keep on going. But one moment I was having tea with an ambassador asking me to design his golf course. I'd never designed a golf course in my life, but rightly or wrongly, you learn to say, yes, I can do it, and then work out how to do it afterwards. But these days, I tend not to do that. If it's not my skill set, particularly if it's writing, as I have done recently, say, no, that's not my particular niche, but I will introduce you to somebody who can. It didn't work out, but things in life, as we all know, don't necessarily. But I gave it a go. I had a wonderful nearly 4 years and no regrets. It's just one of those things, it didn't work out. Politics, and in the end, economics got in the way and we had to come home. But yes, met some wonderful people who I can call friends, lots to write about. And there's no doubt about it now when you feel down and you think, I only have to think of those times. And it gave me an international perspective too. I realized that it's a big wide world and that I learned to look outside the little bubble that is the UK and realize it's a big world, and that's good. So that's my story. And it's life's a little quieter in many ways these days, and that's just fine.
That's just fine indeed. It seems like you did learn a lot there, Charles, and what I like about the story is you talked about the idea that it didn't necessarily have the happy ending that you might have wanted it to, but at the same time the happy beginnings and the happy middle actually are the reason that jumping out of your comfort zone are not giving you regrets, because why would you regret doing something that felt amazing and that you learned so much from at the time? Thank you so much for reading the story and for sharing it with us. And we will talk about that more as we continue with this episode of the podcast. And of course, we will find out more about you as well. But before we do that, let's have a quick introduction.
You're listening to Storytelling with Puck, the podcast designed to show the power of stories in life and in business. Stories connect us on a deeper level, which is why we'll be sharing, chatting about, and feeling the impact they have on every one of us. Your host, Stefano, is the founder of Puck Creations, and we work with your business to define a clear, consistent, relevant brand which stands out from the crowd. We use that brand to create content that makes your audience think, feel, and take action. Visit puckcreations.com to find out more.
Before you do that, let's grab a glass of red and sit out in a perfectly formed garden and think about all the things we would write if we were to tell the stories of real estate agents. Actually, no need for that. We'll ask our guest, the magnificent Charles Waters, to write instead. Charles, we loved your story, but please tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and what you're doing now.
Thanks, Stephanie. Right, well, I'm a forces child, one of 3 boys. So my poor mum, I think growing up, 3 boys, my dad, the only woman in the house, she deserved the medal she never got. But we moved around. I can still remember playing amongst the wrecks of Tobruk in Libya, where my dad was station commander. This was before certain Mr. Gaddafi took over, so it was the early 60s. And there's a photograph of me, a little blondie with my 2 brothers, not a stitch on us, playing amongst the wrecks in the crystal clear blue water. And yeah, these World War II wrecks behind, and anybody in sort of health and safety would have been having a complete head fit. But
I can imagine.
Yeah. And yeah, it's the days when, we moved around a lot. So I went to boarding school, because sort of a forces kid, which was, it was a world that's changed a lot. Thank goodness.
Where were you? Which boarding school were you at?
Well, it was one in Oxfordshire. It's still there, in fact, but it was like I'd beamed into another planet. People think boarding school, you've got to be wealthy. Well, you have, unless your mother's cousin happens to be the headmaster, and then you get a shoe in that.
Okay.
So, but it was times that I look back now with sort of mixed feelings. I met some very interesting people, but. It was like I'd been onto another planet. There was somebody he was the son of the Shah of Iran's, one of his ministers. So and there was the son of the chairman of the BBC at the time. It was quite bizarre. And then they were rocking up in their Rolls Royces, and Mum and Dad were dropping us off in the Morris Minor. So it was. So
you had the nicer car, is what you're saying.
I like to think so. I met some great people, and. The food was awful. It was the time of miners' strikes and blackouts, and you're thinking, and I tried explaining to people the old telephone when you could phone home once a term, and they said, what? I said, yeah, no, this was a telephone on a wall. It's one of those things with a dial, and so it was, but you learn to be at home, away from home for a very long time, which I found challenging at times. I talked to my brothers about it. I learned to cope. My middle brother loved it. My youngest brother will never talk about it and hated it. So you talk to different people, you get different reactions. But for me, I learned to cope. And later in life, when I was traveling in my 30s around the world, I found being on my own, I like people, but I'm also comfortable on my own, and I can cope with it for quite long periods. And I realize it all stems back to that. You learn how to fend for yourself, those days. This was the 70s. I can remember watching it was Princess Anne's wedding in colour. This was a big deal. People crease up now, but this was first colour TV we'd ever seen, and we were all, trooped in to watch this. TV was a luxury. There was a telephone, so you made up your own place. So, you used to go and play in the woods. Again, anybody with health and safety would have been having a head.
Amazing for your imagination and creativity and.
Exactly. Yeah, and you used to come back with, quite a few cuts and scrapes, and choices were limited. So there was no football or rugby. You played rugby, which anybody outside of Britain should have a health and safety alert, because it's one of the most dangerous sports there is. And I fortunately I liked it. I wasn't afraid of it, but I wasn't built for it. And it's amazing I didn't end up with a broken neck, even if I was small. Yeah,
it can be a tough sport. I used to play rugby for my school team in high school. And I love rugby. I love watching it, and I really enjoy playing it. But I've had a bad back ever since my last year of high school, and that was purely from being in the scrum in rugby, because I would never get into the front row of a scrum now. I'm nowhere near the right size, but back then I was a big lad, and so.
Well, I was a shorty, 5'7", and I can't remember what it is in pounds. So 11.5 stones. Anyway, it's. I was short and light, and I gave up at university when I was like 9 stone and a half stone, and the lightest person on the field after me was 11 stone. And I thought, this is going to end badly.
Yeah. So, when you think about some of the players who play professionally and are 20 stone, and a lot of them are 20 stone of muscle, there's not much fat on them either. It's
yeah. I tried to. I had a good laugh talking with somebody on my travels from the States. I said in the States, so it's a bit like American football. You're trying to attack everybody who hasn't got the ball. In rugby, it's the other way around. Everybody jumps on the person who has got the ball.
So one person gets destroyed.
So toughen me up, and but I wouldn't. I'm glad we've moved on, and it was. Yeah, strange times. Years later, I had to go to court. No, I didn't go to court, fortunately, but I was asked to give evidence. I was asked, there was a particular person at the school who'd been teaching us. Had there been anything, had I experienced anything bad with this person? I said, no, I was totally honest. I said, no, I haven't. And nothing ever happened with it. But
had other people in your school?
Well, ironically, the case was being brought by the 2 bullies at the school at the time, which I thought was fascinating. But
okay, we won't obviously mention any names or anything here. We don't want to.
No. But, no. It never came to anything, and it was. But it did. When I see these things in the the press, I understand. But nothing happened to me, and but it was times that there was no controls, absolutely none at all, and I look back and think. Yeah.
A lot of the CBD checks and things that we have now weren't in place, or if they were very minimal.
No. Right. There was a lot of freedom, but absolutely no checks, which is good and bad. Mm-hmm. And one day I'll write the book that my wife keeps badgering me about, but there will still be bits that I'll need to have to edit out, I think. So
yeah, I guess so. I mean, you can write your own story. I guess the challenge is always making sure that you're not naming people in a negative way, even if you feel they deserve it. But
no. I wouldn't. I mean, but one thing it did tell me is I've always hated bullies. So and I'm not shy of dealing with them either, which wasn't terribly clever on the rugby pitch, but but that's what I call a sort of a flash temper, which fortunately I've sort of learned to deal with. But in the workplace, it was something you sort of have to learn to deal with. But that's good. I found myself in the wine trade after university, quite by accident.
Tell me tell me a little bit more. Let's just try and kind of put all the pieces together. So you were at boarding school. You had a challenging time there, but as you say, there were also good moments, and the difficulties that lots of people talk about when going to boarding school were true, and for you not being one of the people at the richer end of the boarding school made a bit of a difference as well. Yeah. And then you left there to go to which university did you go to?
Well, in those days, it wasn't even a university. It's they call it Oxford Poly these days. Okay. But it was Oxford Brookes University. So it was, it was good. It was good fun. It's partly deliberate. I knew there was a big wide world out there, and I knew that everybody hadn't gone to schools like I had, and I wanted to get into an environment that was vaguely like the real world that I knew was out there. So.
And if you'd gone to Oxbridge rather than Oxford Brookes, then you wouldn't have met that many people a bit more like you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was one of those instances where, when they say you don't necessarily need to go to university. Yeah. Well, I'm probably a shining example where I thought, well, I enjoy history and English, but I don't want to do a straight English degree or history degree. I'll do something practical. I know, I'll do English and book publishing. So I did, but it's also one of those occasions where you realize after a year, you should actually change, and because it's not working out. But I thought I was one of those children that I wasn't good at sticking at things. So I thought, no, I'm going to prove to my mother that I can actually stick at something and see it to the bitter end. So I did, but actually I should have quit and done something else, because I realized leaving Oxford Polytechnic with English and book publishing, well, I tried to get into book publishing, and so were a lot of others, and there was a recession. And I realized that I'd made a big mistake. The best way of getting into publishing then, this was publishing when there was actually printing presses, and computers are only just come in, and you learned that the best way of getting a job in publishing was to knock on the door and say, yeah, I'll make the tea, and learn to bang a typewriter.
So, tell me a little bit more then, because you mentioned there, maybe the degree wasn't the degree that you wanted to have, but how was university life? You mentioned the struggles of boarding school, but was university life, did you feel a bit more like you fitted in there with the people, with the more kind of your kinds of people? Or?
Yeah, I did. Particularly socially, and in my class, it was a good social breakup mix of people who'd been to private school and many who hadn't, and that was good. Is what I wanted, and the same on the sports pitch, and people I mixed with socially. Guy I played rugby with, he that's right, he was doing a science degree, and we did a quid pro quo. I helped edit, and this is where I first realised that okay, maybe I can actually, I'm reasonably competent in the English language, because I was editing, proofreading, and rehashing his essays, probably more than I should have done, and his end thesis. Okay. And in the end, and then he helped me with my maths, because I've always, maths and I have had an uneasy relationship all the way. Yeah, my academic results when it comes to maths don't bear close scrutiny. And
in a sense, though, it's interesting because you mentioned that you felt like you went into the wrong degree and you weren't able to get into book publishing afterwards, but you had a good experience at university, and also, okay, you didn't get into book publishing, but you were doing English, and as we'll get to, we'll save this, so we won't talk about it just yet. But where you are now as a writer, and so having that background and having that degree, and having an understanding of a better understanding of English through university, even though it didn't feel like the right degree at the time, would you say that it's helped you a little now?
Yes. There was a. It showed me a lot about the ins and outs of editing, proofreading. I realised now, having done some more recently, that I'd forgotten how. It's one of those things you forget how much you'd taken in at the time and how much you know. Whether it's silly things like the little symbols they use, or just I can scan a piece now and quite good at editing. I mean, I was even thinking of doing proper editing qualification now. I thought, actually, just a brush up. And I realised how much I'd taken in at the time. And the people I'd sort of dismissed as old fuddy-duddies, most ex-journalists, actually, although they hadn't been in journalism for a while, they knew their stuff.
They know their stuff, yeah. And it's important that they know their stuff. I actually find sometimes I read some modern journalism and I find some of the writing atrocious, if I'm honest with you. But yeah, journalism used to be where you would find only the best grammar, and the editing was always perfect, and you wouldn't see mistakes in older newspapers. And I find in some website material, shall we say, these days, even at some of the bigger publishers, it's not as good as it could or should be.
No, and these days, actually, one of the biggest challenges, particularly for people who've been schooled in journalism, is that all the rules are being thrown up in the air, and it's being challenged. So it's interesting from an editing point. I mean, I've had to just write posts for LinkedIn, for example, for completely unlearning all that I've been taught, all sorts of things like never ever start a sentence with but or this kind of thing, or forget it, put a comma wherever the hell you like. What? No, and so it's been interesting, and just completely relearning language I've thought I knew for the web, and I'm an old git of sort of 62 now, and at
that's
times,
still very young, Charles. That's still very young.
Thank you. I'm thinking, it's a desertification up tops, accelerated, but no, it was a good grounding for interesting times now.
And so let's go back to them. Well, I'm going to try and keep this relatively chronological. So
yeah, sure.
You finished your university degree. You went out. You couldn't find a publishing job. How did you go from being in that position to drinking lots of wine? Sorry, I mean working in the wine industry.
No. Yeah, actually, you're not actually too close to the mark for comfort, but it's interesting. Recently, I did psychometric tests, and I now understand myself better because in the past I look. My career is not conventional, and I realize that's because one of the things, I'm a spare of the moment kind of person. So I thought, well, I can't keep trudging up to London in a suit, and going for jobs where you're 200-300 people. And I thought, I got to do something. So I thought, okay, let's get a job. So I just looked, saw an advert for staff needed in a wine shop.
Okay,
my dad drinks wine. I've even enjoyed a bit myself. It was the days of, have you heard of Leaf for a Milch? The stuff, thank God, is, it should have had a health warning. Germany was flogging off all the rubbish they didn't want to sell themselves and chucked in half a kilo of sugar. And but my parents drank it by the bucketful because it was cheap.
Right, fair enough.
Yeah, and anyway, so I thought I went for this job, and I got it. The person interviewing me was, I'd never met anybody like this before. She was in a Dennis the Menace top, sneakers, and it was like no conventional interview. It was more like just a chat like we're having now, and no suits, just informal chat. And at the end of it, she said, well, you want the job? Oh, what do you mean? Like, yes, okay. And she said just one thing. She said, I'm a lesbian. I said, oh, are you? And she said, yes. So what do you feel about that? I said, I don't know. I've never met mum before. So it doesn't bother me. Let's give it a go.
Amazing. It's amazing that she felt like she had to tell you that. It's interesting, actually. I saw
it was 1982.
No, exactly. Yeah.
I had a ball. This was the days before supermarkets had a booze license. In fact, this is a book my wife wants me to write, my wine trade days. This was the days of Western Cider delivering cider on the back of a horse-drawn, trap with delivering gallon jars that if you put in the window at the height of summer, there'd be an almighty explosion as the cork, blew off.
Yeah.
And you had cider everywhere, and some poor 80-year-old lady at the counter apparently having a heart attack as she was buying her sherry. But it was just fantastic times. I was the lady interviewing me. I had then learned had a degree in, I can't remember, and the two guys I was working with, one had a maths degree from Cambridge. He couldn't get into what he was doing, and said the other guy, I forget, but we were all graduates who we were on the same wavelength. We were doing the Telegraph cryptic crossword when we weren't serving customers, and we were working for a company. Actually, they're still alive and kicking. Just Oddbins, they were called. They were the game changers in the industry that turned it from a stuffy, suited, you will do it this way, and you will come from a private school, and you will, to hell with all that. They rewrote the rule book. They were like sort of the Richard Bransons of the wine trade. And only now do I realize how lucky I was, because I caught them on the tail end of their best years, when it was a lesson in retailing of customer service, because basically how can you enthuse about the product if you don't know what you're selling? So they taught me how to sell, and that started with learning the product. So I did all the wine exams. So
amazing. So you became a sommelier?
Pretty much. In a wine shop, I got the one below the Master of Wine. And in fact, one of my best buddies, he had to go at the Master of Wine itself 3 times, which is a real toughie.
Okay. I'm sure at least a few of you Well, think of yourselves as masters of wine. Maybe you're enjoying one as you listen to the charming writer and storyteller that is Charles Waters. We'll be discovering more about his time with the grapes. We'll take a world trip with him, and we'll find out how you can get in touch later in the show. There'll also be a story from Puck Creations. Before all of that, our friend Jackie Goddard gives you the power to speak.
My creativity at its best, it's a real exploring, it's a surprising journey.
I think creativity is just
the antidote to insanity, and it's productive originality.
Surprising answers, inspiring stories, motivational, educational, inspirational. Wise words with Power to Speak the podcast. Find us on your favourite podcast platform or watch on YouTube at Power to Speak the podcast with me, Jackie Goddard.
Now anybody can do those qualifications, but in the end they were trade only. But the company paid for them, and they insisted you go for them.
They wanted their staff to have the expertise required to be able to speak to people who would probably have a mixture of some people who would have those expertise and some people who would know absolutely nothing, right? Yeah,
they didn't want people who were there just because it was a job.
Okay.
You didn't stick around long. And it was wonderful. Independent producers. And then it changed overnight when the supermarkets got a booze license. And then it was very cutthroat. And the company quickly, like they all do, got into difficulties. And suddenly we were taken over by a big American corporation. And that's when, put bluntly, the fun went out of it. And I stuck it for a lot longer than I should have done.
So when was this? Roughly, what kind of year was this happening?
When did the booze supermarkets get a booze license? End of the 80s. So end of the 80s, And it was a big American corporation took it over, and then suddenly, I was being asked to. I was introduced to mission statements and things that were completely. I thought, what is this? And from crafting very individual, you part of what Obbins taught you was you could use your brain and craft your own. You use your creativity. So the shelf talkers, everything you saw in a shop was individually written, but it was your own opinion. Suddenly, when you were taken over by a big corporation who were being given large sums of money, should we say, to sell wines by big corporations themselves. Obbins, for example, were the people who put Australian wine and American wine on the map in Britain. And there were big sums of money sloshing around to promote these wines. And suddenly you had to toe a line and promote. You couldn't just say what you wanted. You had to promote specific wines. You had to promote them in a way that they maybe spoke about a particular aspect of the wine, which they knew was the thing that everybody was after because it was the trend at that moment in time. Yes. It's marketing. It's done on a corporate level. Exactly. I didn't know that's what it was called, but I realized what I'd been taught. And still, even though it was within a corporate framework, was marketing, even if I was never formally trained in it. And I was doing a lot of the shelf talkers. I read a few newsletters. And I now realize I was given these because I could write. But at the same time, I identified the skills of others. So I had some great graphic designers. I had a brilliant guy the same guy who went for the Master of Wine. He knew his wine, and he's also a superb artist, whether it was with chalk paint. He was a company's dream for on blackboards, windows, anything. But I realized that I struggled to toe the corporate line. And I mean, if I'm honest with myself, looking back, I threw the baby out with the bathwater. I probably left in the end when I was pushed. It was a fine line, but
okay. Was that just because you weren't doing what they asked you to do, or were you doing something in particular that caused problems?
No, I did, but in the end, by the end I was a manager of £1 million branch.
Oh wow!
And actually, I realised I was very little of my time was talking to customers about wine. Most of it was dealing with head office instructions, dealing with people, and I was working ridiculous hours, like this kind of doctor's work, and drinking too much. There were a number of my colleagues. I'd never crossed the line, but I came close. Basically,
Okay.
You drink to keep going, and not clever, and burning the midnight oil, and partying just to keep going, and eventually the music has to stop. So it did. But I look back now, and I learned a lot. But I made a choice that if you want to still enjoy wine to any degree, and I stayed within the branch level, whereas those who were prepared to climb the corporate ladder took the next step to sort of head office and went that route. In retrospect, I probably turned my back on it too hastily, but if there's one thing I've learned, don't keep looking in the rear view mirror. It's a waste of time. So I don't. I made the choice then, and I sort of live with it.
Yeah. Also, as well, you never. The thing is, and this is the reason I think you're saying don't look back in the rearview mirror. Makes a lot of sense, and will resonate with people is because you don't know how things would have turned out. So you could have chosen a different career path. You could have chosen to stick there. You could have chosen to have gone down the corporate world. That maybe would have tipped you over the edge when it came to drinking, or it might have got you into a position that you absolutely loved, or it could have, I don't know, it could have caused you to have a big argument with the people at the top, and to then not be able to go on to whatever it is that you did next, which we'll talk about in a second. There's so many paths, and we have no idea what would have happened if we did something different. So exactly. I agree with your point. There's no point in regretting it. In fact, think about the brilliant times you had, especially when you first started there, and then let's have now a conversation about what happened next.
Yes, when I handed over the keys and said goodbye to the wine trade, I thought, right, well, now what? And that was my first moment when I think, okay, it's time to do what I never did properly after university, which is go travelling.
Amazing.
After university, I did interrailing, which anybody knows is, you go around Europe on a 100 quid as it was then, and you have a ball, which I did. But I thought, no, there's a big wide world out, and I want to explore it. So I did. I got myself a round the world ticket. I was 34, 35, and I started in South Africa for the Rugby World Cup in 1995, and I took it from there.
You were in South Africa for the Rugby World Cup?
Yeah.
That particular Rugby World Cup especially, that's incredible.
Yeah. So I had a ball, and when I wasn't watching rugby, either in the stands or in on the TV in bars or with people I was staying with, I basically went to see all the wine producers. I basically hired bicycles, took the train out to the winelands, hired a bicycle and was pedaling around on a bone shaker that probably shouldn't never have been rented out, and rocking up to some really quite prestigious wineries, and they could not have been nicer to this scruff bag that turned up. And in Australia, actually, I was in where I went on to. I was in, they said, well, do you want to stick around for the season? I couldn't, but in retrospect, I wished I had in New Zealand. But
when you were doing this, when you were going to these different wineries, were you there just as a customer having fun, or were you there trying to get work?
In retrospect, if one of the things I have, even now, I need to improve on is planning. I'm a spare of the moment. And in retrospect, if I'd really sort of thought about it, I could have organized jobs, lined things up, and I wished I had, but I hadn't. And I had plans to travel further north. It's one of those things, well, I could come back. Mm-hmm. Well, no, you don't, because Africa's vast. So I kept moving north. But I met some great people, and I moved north to Zimbabwe, where my family were, and that's where I didn't meet my wife then, but I had family there, cousins. And
so your cousins were there because of obviously you mentioned at the beginning that your family were moving around because your dad was in the service, and so
Yeah, no, this was. Yeah, I had cousins in Zimbabwe because my mum had a sister. She's one of seven, and one of her sisters, like my wife's mother, actually, after the war, Britain wanted people to. They needed people in the colonies to boost the empire and get it kick-started up. And my aunt and my mother-in-law were two of those people in the 50s who, life in Britain, this was still rationing. It was pretty bleak. It wasn't much fun. So they thought, yeah, let's give it a crack. So that's what my aunt did. And and her children grew up there, went to school there. And so I met them. I stayed, and I came back. I stayed with my aunt on this occasion, traveling, and she was my base. And then she dumped me at the Coca-Cola stand, as you do one day, and said, off you go. And I stood there with my thumb out, and at the age of 30-something, and I thought, well, so I did, and I hitched a ride, all sorts of, lots of sort of interesting rides. And then local buses in, I got as far as the border, northern Tanzania, the border with Kenya.
Okay.
And taking local buses, trains, buying fruit from the side of a railway carriage and, handing over, dirty, smelly notes that I don't know whose currency they were, but it was accepted. And, and you just realize how vast Africa is. I had to backtrack because I'd left half a chunk of my money back in Zimbabwe because I didn't want to. These were the days of, this is the days before chip and pin and.
Yeah, even travelers checks, I'm guessing, were not.
No, I had a few travelers checks, but it was that kind of, and you had to be very careful with your money.
Of course,
and my Lonely Planet. I had the Lonely Planet to Africa, the big one, and there was a section that had unflattering comments about the president of Tanzania at the time. So, and by then I'd got my confidence up, and I thought, well, okay. And so I just kept the section that I needed and ripped it out and binned the book. But I spent months there, and then flew to Australia and rinse and repeat through Australia and then New Zealand. In New Zealand, I worked for my keep. Anybody's heard of willing workers on organic farms? That was fun. Everything from painting somebody's house to cleaning beehive trays. I thought,
and this was in return for accommodation and food.
Yeah. And there was one guy I remember staying at Martinborough in New Zealand. I thought, well, I'll go there if there's a house sit, because that's my wine trade knowledge. That's where the best Pinot Noirs are grown in New Zealand. And I thought, yep, I can smell an opportunity here. So I stayed with them for 2-3 weeks and painted the house for them, mixed some cement, and in return, they lent me their car. The gearbox packed up, but it wasn't my fault. But
I like how you still getting that in there, just in case they're listening.
Well, they weren't surprised when they got a phone call, and I said, I think you're going to have to need to come and fetch me. But it's all part of life's experience. It was wonderful. I mean, I went to the top winery there in New Zealand, there, Cloudy Bay, which they were the people who said, do you want to stick around for the season? It's one of those occasions where you just say yes. And I thought about it. No, big mistake. You just say yes. And you make up a plan. But no, I kept on going. And I hitched around New Zealand for 4 months. And I was amazed. I mean, a lonely bloke in I was picked up by a middle-aged lady. I said, are you? I couldn't believe she was actually picking me up. I said, this would never have happened in Europe. She said, oh, well, look, I just make a judgment. You looked all right. Okay.
No, it's interesting. I've hitchhiked myself a few times in New Zealand, and I've always just been, it's always been open-armed and kindness. Now, I'm not necessarily advising everyone to hitchhike, and there are definitely dangers to it, and you've got to be extremely careful. But the experience is incredible, and the kindness of strangers that you find from doing that. As you say, somebody picking you up, it's a risk for them and it's a risk for you.
Yeah.
But the reward is also massive when it goes well. So there's the balance to be had. I think when you do get picked up, being a hitchhiker is very different to getting a train or driving somewhere or any other form of transport, because you're getting to meet somebody and you're getting to understand a local's way of life and just kind of find out about them. And I think that's what's so powerful about hitchhiking.
Yeah, and the people who pick you up, and that's part of the, particularly when you're on your own. I mean, in New Zealand, I was picked up by two city traders from the New York Stock Exchange, and they said, "Well, hop in the back," and I looked at, "Well, like where?" So I mean, I sort of climbed in my rucksack first, and it was payback for them. You know, they'd been hitching themselves 10, 15 years before, and it was payback for them. And so it was just. It also made me sort of realize that how to take opportunities and not judge people, and nothing will surprise you. It's when I realized in Australia that the number of people who've, there was a professor from somewhere in the States, she'd retired. She was going to sit on her backside just waiting for the daisies to grow, waiting for the end to come. She was, in her 50s, just, and she had the bucks, and she was like, I said, "How long are you going for?" Oh, I don't know, couple of, 6 months. Okay.
Amazing.
And so, and so on I went, and for about a year and a half through, Asia, Komodo dragons, I hitched through, because I went from Australia to Indonesia, island hopping. Yeah, in the days when Indonesia was still in the hands of the military. And
right, yeah. What year was this?
This was 95, 96.
95, 96, because I'm trying to picture. So at the time as well, it was a lot less common for people to do these kind of long travels and to go.
It was interesting times on a number of occasions. Probably the most interesting was going to see Angkor Wat in Cambodia before, while the Khmer Rouge was still active in certain sections. So it's one of those occasions where do you just want to hire a motorbike and trundle off when you aren't a local? No. So
that's not.
I hired a local, and he knew where the safe, because there was no sign saying this, stop, don't go any further. You could unwittingly suddenly be in an area where they were still in control. It was still when there was a new British engineer, I think, who in the end they did find he had been killed years ago, but nobody knew, and the place was full of unexploded bombs, and but that was probably the most interesting. I think there was one backpackers. It was before basically everything changed, and suddenly there were 4 hotels and coaches piling in, and
I think even now, because I was in Cambodia about 12 or 13 years ago, and even at that point it was starting to become quite commercial. I think to this day it's probably a lot more so, but I still think it's somewhere where we don't have time to go into it today, but if people aren't aware of the killing fields and people aren't aware of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot and the atrocities that happened there, please do look those things up, because it's so important for our understanding and our grasp of history and how we don't want those kind of things to be repeated.
Yeah, I don't like what I call tourist, being a voyeur at some of these places, but there's sometimes I thought the things you just have to do. So I went to Robben Island when I was in Cape Town. It's not something I need to go back twice, but I thought it's one of the things I thought I had to do.
I think it depends on your attitude when you go to a lot of these places as well. If you're going there, as you say, it can be quite voyeuristic. But there's also, if you're going there to genuinely learn and you're trying to understand and get a feel for the place and a feel for what went on, which you can never 100% do, of course, because you're not there whilst those things are going on and you're not the victim of them. But I think, if you go into these kinds of places for the right reasons, then it's okay. If you go into these kind of places because you want to take a selfie, I'd advise against it. Personally.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so Cambodia was a good example. I went to the killing fields. I went to the prison where all the stuff, and it's It's just something I felt I had to do. It was shocking. I mean, it just sort of lives with you for life and puts things in perspective. So yeah. Anyway, I went through Asia. I went on the back of a motorbike from Vietnam to Cambodia to China, and that's why I finished. I didn't mean to, but I realized in Beijing after a year and a half when I ran up against a wall of bureaucracy. I ran out of funds into a wall of bureaucracy, and my health packed up. So it's time to. It's one of the occasions when you realise it's time to call it quits.
I know the feeling. We've been speaking for a while, and I've absolutely loved these stories. And actually, what you've done throughout this conversation is showing people why it is that you're such a good representative of their business, because you're able to tell stories, and stories are what matter when it comes to persuading people and getting people to understand who you are and to build relationships. And I think that anybody listening to this today is going to connect with you on a much deeper level, because they're going to get the excitement of the travels, the ups and downs of working in a wine shop, and understanding how wine works, understanding how small businesses work, understanding how corporations work, which lots of us have been through in our own individual ways. But these stories are what connect us. But we haven't even got on to your travels back and forth from Africa. We haven't got on to...
I know.
Sorry, go on.
I know, this is the trouble. When I was putting my LinkedIn profile together, I actually got a LinkedIn trainer to help me, because I said I've had... it's not a conventional CV, and I said I didn't actually know how to put it together, because my career, if you can call it that, is 15 years in wine, traveling, then 15 years in landscaping.
Amazing.
And how did I get into that? Well, because exactly the same again. I came home and I thought, well, okay, do I want to go back into the wine trade? Yeah, but not as I did before. But I need to do something. And there was a mate, he had been one of my staff. He said, well, he was a garden designer who did also the basic gardening, getting your hands dirty and he said, well, do you want a job? So yeah, okay. I need to earn some money. So I did. And here we go again, this time. Well, I took over his business, such as it was, because he was moving to the States. He married he was getting married to a lovely American lassie who I met. And he said, here's my business. Well, I mean, we're not talking, I didn't buy it for, a few £1,000s. He basically gave me a couple of clients who disappeared within a few weeks, because that's when you realize people went to him because it was him. So
he built up a brand.
He built up the brand. Anyway, it gave me something to start with, but I wasn't afraid of hard graft, and it was. So I learned I learned a lot from him. I realized how much I knew anyway, because my dad had given me the love of gardening. And I also realized I'm an outdoor person. I love mountains, and that's why I like walking in the mountains and gardening even now, because I like being outdoors. I'm not good at sitting in an office, which as a writer now has proved challenging at times. I took over his business and I built it up. And I developed my own set of clients. And after a while, I quickly realized I didn't want to be what they call in Britain, I don't know in the States, but a man with a van. If I was just doing it for the money, I think I'd have lasted about 6 months. In fact, in a way, I've never done it from the money, even now, which is, I probably shouldn't say that, but if it was just money was the only driver, I wouldn't do anything for long. And it was the same with this.
To be honest, I think actually you say you shouldn't say that, but one of the things we talk about all the time with the businesses that we work with, and from some of our conversations previously, that a big part of our business, as well as writing, like you do, is helping people to define their brand and understand who they are as a business. And one of the key aspects we talk to, whether or not this is to freelancers, smaller businesses, and even to some of the bigger corporate companies that we work with, is if your staff are only working, or if you're only working purely for the money, the chances are after a while you're going to get really bored with it, upset with it, and either give it up or not do your best. Whereas if you have a genuine motivation, a genuine reason for doing what you're doing, and it's the old Simon Sinek why, but it's more than that. There's a whole brand that surrounds you and kind of your personality, and you understand the way you want to interact with people. If you have all of that, and by the sound of everything you've said today, you've had that in every career that you've been in, a genuine passion for it, you're much more likely to do a good job.
Yeah, it's true. And I realized very quickly, as I said, I had a brain in my head, and I thought, if I'm going to do this seriously, I want to know my plants. So again, I'm quite well qualified in plants, and ask me about anything about plants, mainly British, but I actually got working in Zimbabwe. I did the same. I know quite a bit about Southern Hemisphere plants now, because I thought, I want to use the brain in my head. So I did some of the RHS exams, and then eventually I realized, in a way, I realized that's what I should have done when I left school. But those opportunities weren't available at the time. But now,
so you seized the day when they came available. Just quickly for anybody who doesn't know, RHS is Royal Horticultural Society.
Royal Horticultural Society, and if I was to advise my young self now, I would say go for the best. Gardening can be a proper job, and just get the best qualification you can, and probably one of the best is, in Britain at least, is the Q diploma. America will have its equivalent, in fact it does, and do it, and it's tough, and then you go and work for the big estates. That's what I would have done, what I'd be telling my increasingly aging self when I did it. But I did some of the qualifications, the RHS exams, and I kept going for myself. And I met some, worked for some great clients, and one or two of them, yes, I'm still in touch with, and amazingly enough, they'll give me a reference. So I must have done something right. And after a while, I thought I'd reached the point where, no, I can't go any further with this. Thought, no, I've got as far as I can. So what next? So I did a garden design diploma, and because I realized very quickly it's amazing. And just by washing, scrubbing my hands, putting on a smarter set of clothes, putting the tools away, and then turning up at some smart house, they look at you in a completely different way than I'd turned up in my scruffy clothes with tools in the back, and coming straight from the potting shed. And it's all that. It was one of those occasions when you will learn about first impressions, and appearance is everything. There's a whole lot more to running a business and being a garden designer than knowing about plants. And incredibly, the only person on that course that knew anything about plants that came from a horticultural background was me. And that's when you realize, as I did in property investing later on, you'll never have the entire skill set. So work with others, collaboration. So it was my skill set, and I helped people for whom it definitely wasn't. And they helped me with, anything to do with media and computing. I realized I was seriously in the deep end when I was asked to do a PowerPoint, and I had to quietly ask the person next to me, I said, what is it? I thought, oh my God. I said,
not how do you use PowerPoint? What is PowerPoint?
No, what is it? Never mind how do you use it. And that's when I practically died. So by the end I actually managed to do a PowerPoint present, because at the end of the course, which was 3 years part-time, I had to do a presentation with PowerPoint. Well, it's one of those occasions where you don't know what you're capable of until you're logged in the deep end big time. And I realized also that one of the things, I'm not a natural team player, which has also been a challenge. I realize it's one of the reasons why in sport I had to really work at it. Why I've had to work at being a team player, and I learned again that don't try and do it all yourself. Work with others, because you don't have the entire skill set, and don't be ashamed to admit it. I teamed up with this guy. He'd been to Eton. He ran a scaffolding company. And we did this design. We designed this garden and exhibited it. And I also realized he took me on he wanted to work with me for entirely different reasons. I'm quite a good designer, but he actually took me on for my writing skills. We nearly went into business together because he wanted me to run a nursery and promote it with my writing skills. And it's just a shame it never came to be. Until then, the penny hadn't dropped, because people said, you're quite good at writing, so why don't you do it for a living? And then, no. Anybody can write. And I think to a degree, yes, I can. And the opportunities there with modern media, I mean, quite rightly, people can. But yeah, at the time I just...
But there's a skill, and this is something you definitely have. There's a skill to writing in a way that is not only grammatically correct, that is not only because of the English skills you have, but it also links into the business skills that you developed over time, also links into all of the stuff we talked about earlier in terms of your career path, and then understanding the importance of using writing to persuade people and to get them to do something. And the type of writing that you do now is all about that. It's all about getting people to read something and connect with whether or not it's landscaping companies or it's wineries or it's to do with real estate, or if it's something completely different that you have to dig in and research. No matter what it is that you're writing about, the important thing is that you can understand their language and then put it into a language that their readers are going to understand. And I've seen a lot of your work in the way that you do that, and it's powerful. And so I think when you say anyone can write, I think anyone can write. But can anyone write to make a difference to somebody's business? Not necessarily. And I think that's where your skill set does come in.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of you to say so. I mean, it's such a rapidly changing world we live and work in that, sometimes I wonder. But it was interesting times. I learned a lot. I did a copywriting diploma with a company in England, but again, I realised it was the tail end of the world as it was then, and press releases were pretty basic stuff. It really was. Whereas types of copy you were being asked to write were just coming in. It was useful, but I also I could tell I was taking a qualification that was rapidly becoming outdated, which is interesting. So, and that's when my parents died and I went off to Zimbabwe and set up a landscaping company. It was a steep graph upwards and equally steep downwards, and I thought, well, I got to do something while I was there. So I started writing a lot. That's when I started with the content mills, Upwork, Elance, and then Upwork, which was interesting, challenged my ideals of integrity and dealing with people. But it was interesting. My first 2 clients were in the States, so I was writing blogs for estate agents or realtors. They are, I said, well, you tell me what, and they said, you need to change this and that. We say this here and that. Yeah, okay. And that's when I quickly realized that it's American English that is basically rules in the world. It was good for me to know. So I was people in the States, in Holland, asking me, or Germany once, saying, well, can you just write British English, or can you do American English? I said, which do you want? And usually it's American. It's fine. And it wasn't just about wine. I can remember asking an insurance company, I said, this is English, but not as I know it. Can you, in the nicest possible way, translate it for me? Because who are you pitching it at? If it's people in the industry, they'll understand, but I don't. And if you're trying to appeal to people outside the industry, Joe Public, which they were, I said, I think we need.
The problem with jargon, it's a lot of the time. A lot of the time, when we're in our own worlds, we talk to each other in a way that we understand perfectly well what we're saying to each other because it's about our industry. But as soon as you are trying to adopt that language and make it worthwhile to your customers, some of our listeners will know that I come from a background in sales and marketing, and it's one of the quickest things they tell you is do not use industry speak unless you really have to. Unless it's your audience, understand who you were speaking to, and I think your conversation with the insurance company highlights that.
Yes,
exceptionally.
Yeah. You also learn how to deal with people's expectations and what you will and will not. As anybody who's been on, and I know that Jennifer, who I had a lovely chat with, who's and gets clients through at work, knows that sometimes clients' expectations and yours, they need to be aligned. But when you're starting out, you're desperate, but you learn to say no. And I also realized there was some I pitched for that I didn't get them, and I probably knew, but it was worth a try. But in the end, it's quite a jungle out there, quite a brutal place to start. But I think it's still a good place to start. I wouldn't dismiss it as some people do.
I mean, I know there's a lady who actually is going to be on episode 3 of this series of the podcast named Eleanor Gold, and she's a fantastic writer. She has done courses and she runs a group called The Copywriter on Facebook. And she's spoken a lot about the power of using things like Upwork well, because if you understand it well and you understand how to put yourself out there, and you use some of the experiences that you have, it's a great place to start, and it can be a great place to get business. And you only need one of the right customers, one customer who does treat you right and does keep coming back to you, to make it actually, it's just another marketplace. It's just another way to market yourself, like LinkedIn is, like in-person networking is, like billboards are. If you treat it as, this is the only place I'm going to go and find work, you're probably going to have problems. If you treat it as another place to market yourself, you could do well out of it, I think.
I'd agree with that. And like any company, if they change, although my skill set is in wine and landscaping, and now we'll leave property investing for another time. But that my last sort of 5, 6, 7 years, 7 years now. It's more showing people I can write rather than specifically the niche. But people say, well, is that all the only niches you write about? Well, no, it's just showing people I can write.
That's it. And the thing is as well, as you said, as I think we mentioned a little bit earlier, yes, they're your areas of expertise in terms of what you've done before, and they give you an extra foot in the door. But one of the most important things about writing, and I think you mentioned this in your LinkedIn profile, is actually being able to research and being able to discover. And we were talking earlier about jargon, and I think when you go into a world, something we always mention to our customers, because we work with a whole range of different industry sectors, is that when you go into a world with very basic knowledge, the chances of you asking the right questions to understand what it is that their customers are going to want to know is much higher, because you don't presume anything. You don't assume that you know X, Y, and Z. So often, if there's a world that I'm not familiar with, I think I end up writing something better because I have to dig in so much more and I have to research so much more to be able to find out about what it is they're trying to sell and get it onto a level that I understand, and therefore their customers are going to understand.
Exactly. I enjoy the research. In fact, probably too much. So I have to sort of be disciplined. And it's probably the biggest challenge that these days, modern media is changing so fast. And I'm, I don't say my brain's slowing down. I'm trying to keep up.
I think that's the one thing they say doesn't slow down so much with age, and as we mentioned earlier, you're not at an old age yet anyway, Charles. But what I am going to do is I'm going to ask our listeners a big favour, and I'm going to ask them to do some of their own research, because I think that they are going to want to find out a lot more about you. They're going to want to have a chat with you. They're going to want to discover more about your property development and your understanding of the retail world. But more importantly, they're going to want to hire you to write for them. So we're going to have to give them the starting point for that research. So where can our listeners find you?
Okay, well, they can find me on LinkedIn. I can pop all the links, send them to you, or pop all the links, out there. I'm on LinkedIn. Them on our show notes. Yeah, LinkedIn, Facebook, and not as active as I should be on Twitter or Facebook, but I am there, particularly LinkedIn, and my website, which I'm going to read it out, which is finally gone live. Went to some vast expense, far more than I spent in years, but it has gone live. I just need to fill it with more up-to-date content. And that's www.charleswaterswritingservices.co.uk. Quite a mouthful, but I will put it, put the link out in the chat.
Amazing, yes. We'll make sure we put all of those links onto the show notes. And also, if you think of anything else or anywhere else you want to send people after the show, you can just send that to me and we'll put that out there. But thank you so much for joining us for the Storytelling with Puck podcast. Thank you for sharing your story. I wish we had more time because there's so much more that I want to find out, but I'm going to personally do that when we have a chat another time, and hopefully our listeners can give you a call and do that at some point as well. Thank you again, and we will, as always, finish the podcast with a story. Sierra de la Pintan. Cyan had found it by doing our usual close your eyes and point at the map style of research. 10 minutes later, with a discovery that it was a place Argentinians frequented frequently, but was lesser known by internationals, we decided it was our next destination. It's stunningly beautiful, breathtaking even. But that's not what this story is about. We arrived with no accommodation booked. That wasn't unusual for us. We preferred it that way, in case we changed our minds at the last minute. Walking into the town with our backpacks strapped around our shoulders, we instantly felt like the place had a charm. The problem was charm wasn't a precursor for hostels. After asking around a little, we eventually discovered Hostel Ruta 76. Enrique greeted us. He told us that the hostel had only just opened. We'd be the second guests they'd ever have if we stayed. He showed us around the place. There were still a few things to get right, but he was rightly proud. As we passed by the guitar sitting next to the sofa, he caught my eye wondering. "Do you play?" he asked with a childlike smile. I told him I did, and we said we'd make an evening of it. We hadn't even agreed to stay by this point, but we all knew we would. After an explanation of where everything was in the town and the things to see in the area, we spent some time exploring. As usual, we had no real plan, but we found somewhere to eat and got chatting to the owners, Lorena and Jorge. After what must have been hours, we headed back to the hostel for a quiet night in. That night ended up being the moment we met Norberto, also known as Rafa, and the first night of guitar playing, laughing, joking, meeting new friends, and thinking, we could stay here a while. With each day that passed, that feeling became stronger. We shared mate, which is a wonderful drink made from yerba mate in hot water. We shared stories. We shared the love of a new hostel that felt more like a second home. Enrique and Rafa had thought about every aspect. They knew what they loved and they knew what they hated. They also knew that some people would love what they love and some people would hate it. Their audience was us. Their audience were all of the people who wanted a place to stay that made them feel like one with the local culture. Many, many days later, many more than we ever thought we'd stay for, we said our goodbyes. Years later, many hostels later, many experiences later, we still remember this wonderful place. Not for the magical landscapes, the pretty town, or the all-you-can-eat pizza restaurant, but for the hostel and the people who made our stay incredible. You've just been listening to an episode of the Storytelling with Puck podcast. Your support keeps our podcast going, so please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. Subscribe to keep up to date with the latest episodes, and never forget the importance of sharing your stories.